Okay, so I've been talking this whole time, and my microphone has been muted. So that's a nice way to start a live stream. Uh, just for the record, I am handling a lot of producing and hosting at the same time. Can be a lot. So I'll just recap what I've been saying to my muted mic in my room alone. So today so apologies for all of the technical difficulties, both the muted mic and what precluded that. Right at the last second, as I was right about to hit go live, my internet shut down and it screwed up a bunch of what I had going on, so it took some time to clean everything up. But now it's time to go live and talk about some Canadian politics from this week. Obviously, today I'm alone. I don't have my partner and co-host Andrew to help me out. So today's episode will be a bit more like a rant and a little less like a conversation. So that'll be different. Hopefully it'll be fun. Andrew's out today celebrating, I believe, his brother's birthday. So happy birthday to Luke, and I hope the Zettles and Andrew enjoy a lovely birthday dinner. But let's get into what we'll be talking about today. So we'll be focused on three main topics. We'll be talking the Quebec election results. We'll be providing a brief NAFTA update, or as it's now called, the USMCA. And we'll be closing off with a segment that I've been thinking about for a little while now on the political spectrum in Canada. So recently I sat down to have a couple beers with a close friend of mine, and he asked me about what I thought about the political spectrum, the political compass, rather. And I think that's a pretty popular topic. It's used a lot online. So I'm going to do a little segment on that and what I think about the political compass, as well as how I think it relates to the political landscape in Canada. So without doing too much more of this kind of bookkeeping stuff, let's jump right into it and start discussing the what we saw in the Quebec election. So here we go. So many pundits are referring to the Quebec election results as a kind of landmark election in kind of Quebec political history. And this is for a number of reasons. So two really core reasons, I would say. So for one, this is the first right-leaning government we've had elected in Quebec in about a century, or at least the furthest right-leaning government we've seen in Quebec in the last century. And on top of that, this was the first election in at least the last 50 years that wasn't totally based around the idea of Quebec nationalism and Quebec sovereignty or succession. In this election, we saw the CAQ, or the Coalition Avenir Quebec, propose a really different platform in that they said they will not ever really have a referendum on secession, which is a huge change in kind of Quebec politics. And I guess it's been really coming over the last few years, over the last even 2 decades or so, since Quebec has been getting more and more integrated to Canada. Of course, there's going to be less and less passion for that succession movement, and we haven't seen a referendum in over 20 years. So obviously there's a little bit less of a passion for that, and that can be seen in the success of the CAQ. So we can take away a lot from this election, but first of all, let's look into who the CAQ is, because of course, since it's a Quebec provincial politics, no one really knows their parties. Everyone's only really familiar with the Liberals, maybe a bit about the Parti Québécois, because they have a kind of federal partner and they've been so divisive throughout Canadian history. But who are the CAQ? So the CAQ are led by François Legault, who is now the premier designate, or the premier-elect. People don't ever really know what to call the premier in that situation, but he was previously a high-profile member of the Parti Québécois, but he left the party in 2011 or 2009 because he said he didn't have the motivation to continue, and he wanted to go back to the private sector, where he had worked previously as an auditor and for some other high-profile companies. 2 years later, he came back, and with a partner from business, he decided to start a new party called the Coalition Avenir Quebec, or the Coalition for Quebec's Future. The main difference in this party, as I already mentioned, was that they do not want to hold a referendum on sovereignty at any point. They do, however, have different, or believe that Quebec should hold a different position in Canada's constitution. So they're not totally, they don't diverge totally from what we've seen from the PQ historically. They're just a little bit more moderate, or at least it's a less extreme idea, although they might pursue it maybe a little bit more zealously. So the Coalition Avenir Quebec is a right-leaning party, which is definitely peculiar in Quebec, which tends to be one of Canada's most furthest left-leaning provinces. Are in favor of making most services provided at a more efficient way, or cutting down red tape, in the air of most right-wing politicians. Francois Legault has also been outspoken in protecting Quebecois identity, as well as reducing immigration. Even going as far to say things that, which I guess I think he's walked back since then, but deporting refugees and immigrants that haven't learned French within 3 years, and even his limitations to immigration. People have questioned the legality of what he's proposed. But in the past, Quebec has typically held a kind of special position constitutionally, and the federal government is usually quick to kind of bend backwards to support Quebec's the Quebec government maintaining their sovereignty and maintaining their culture and stuff like this. So it wouldn't be surprised if despite critics, at least historically for president, it may not be so difficult for him to do this kind of things in preservation of Quebec culture. So Legault has also been under fire, especially this week, because around the banning of religious garb. The Liberal government had introduced a bill which said that it would limit both public servant same kind of symbols. So this would include the niqab, the burqa. I guess it would go as far as to include other symbols, such as slightly different. So anyone in a position of coercive power, so any police officer, any teacher, anyone who wields any authority, can't have any prominent religious symbols. So I guess that's how he plans to sneak in things like crosses and some more low-key religious garb. But people have questioned if this, again, is constitutional at all, because it infringes on, obviously, religious rights and even, in a more nuanced sense, gender rights and stuff like this. But Legault promised this week, much like Doug Ford, Doug's fault, and he started using the notwithstanding clause, and now everyone's going to do it, which is pretty funny because the Quebec government had used the notwithstanding clause more than any other. Is a Coalition Avenue providing lots absolute very, very far left party, also sovereigntist, so they want to succeed and provide a robust welfare state, despite Quebec being one of the highest recipients of equalization payments. So how that exactly would be sustainable would be quite questionable. But they more than doubled their support. I think they went from 3 to 10 seats, which is pretty impressive considering the kind of ridiculousness of their, which at least got a laugh out of me. But this election says a lot for the more the macro kind of political environment in Canada. This is another big victory for right-leaning parties in Canada. We've seen them sweep the kind of country, especially since the Ontario election with Doug Ford. Then we saw, even just the last 2 weeks, as we were talking about last week, an amazing result for the PCs in New Brunswick, which tend to be a liberal stronghold in the Maritimes. And then another right-leaning victory in Quebec. It's expected to be followed in Alberta next year, with Jason Kenney leading the United Conservative Party. That will make almost all the provinces either led by governments that are conservative and against Justin Trudeau, or just against Justin Trudeau. So we have the Saskatchewan Party, and certainly there's going to be some recounts in the next few days. So we'll see if the PCs are able to hold that house, or if there'll be a re-election or whatnot. Then we have the NDP in BC that's obstructing the Trans Mountain Pipeline as much as they can. We'll have the United Conservative Party in Alberta that's almost guaranteed. The Manitoba is led by a PC government. It's absolutely ridiculous. Like it's a huge blue wave, and like it seems from a basic armchair analyst, we would see a sweeping result in voters are leading them, subsequently come out to the next federal election, and it kind of keeps them in a deadlock against each of many things in global politics down south, in American politics down south, and global politics, massive issues of terrorism and immigration and stuff like this. This could be turning, and again, my generation that on the tail end of is supposed to be one of the most conservative generations of all time. So we could see a really growing conservative movement that's fed up with Justin Trudeau and the way he leads and his politically correct, ideological, kind of annoying leadership in favor of stronger, more conservative and individualistic positions, which I think would be overall good. But as long as we're having these conversations and we have strong leaders on all sides, I'll be generally satisfied. But there's a couple more things we can. Another thing that's important to draw away from this, as Maxime Bernier was quick to point to on Twitter, are willing to throw their support behind small insurgent parties, and we saw this both in the New Brunswick election, where the People's Alliance, a similar populist party, was able to have relative success. They could end up holding a important position as the balance of power in that province. And then the CAQ in Quebec, also a non-traditional party, were able to topple the Liberals. So while I do think there is definitely a frustration with the establishment parties, and an establishment movement is definitely been popular in the United States as well as across the world, and I could definitely see the point there. To directly compare the People's Alliance or the CAQ to Maxime's new People's Party is a bit of a stretch. These parties, it's not the same. Most of these parties have been small and growing for a number of years. As I said, the CAQ was founded in 2011, and they've been gaining more and more seats. I guess this is their third election now. They've been steadily gaining, and this is obviously the biggest position they've held. They haven't even held that opposition status before, but it's not the same thing. Like they slowly grew as a party with more and more candidates getting more well known, and Francois Legault becoming more and more popular. It's a totally different task for Maxime Bernier. Not that it's impossible, and obviously there is absolutely a thirst for it, but to throw them off as a one-off comparison is definitely a jump. But I'll say it's a building block, and I'm a big fan of what Maxime Bernier is doing with the People's Party, but we can't get overconfident just because we have results like this, especially when they don't clearly mirror what we're experiencing. So it will be very interesting. A lot of strong leaders coming to power in our provinces, and a lot of strong leaders that are fed up with the federal government and are ready to speak out against it. And that's generally good. We want these people to be testing each other and making sure the result is best for the people ultimately. So I think that's about it on the Quebec government. It would be great if anyone had any questions or anything, but I don't think we're so lucky. So let's jump over to the USMCA. So the USMCA is the new NAFTA, right? NAFTA 2.0. I swear Trump early on in the agreement, he was vocal about how much he hated the name NAFTA, and I was never quite sure why. I think it's a pretty catchy and memorable name for a trade agreement, but I'm pretty sure it was the free trade in considering the result of the new name. I'm pretty sure it was the free trade that bothered him, because it is honestly dishonest. And most FTAs, most free trade agreements, are not really without losing out politically in various different ways, like protecting a dairy cartel because they're an important political faction in Canada's political landscape, for example. Just pulling that out of thin air. So to call them a free trade agreement is kind of fraudulent and dishonest. To have a free trade agreement, you wouldn't need these hundred of page documents. You'd need something that says basically these two countries can trade without taxation across the border. That's simply what free trade is. It's just not what it really developed into when the political class took it out of the hands of the academic class. So I think from the beginning he wanted to strike that, because USMCA is not the nicest name. And I saw a clip from one of his rallies, and he was talking up the name, which I thought was funny. He was really trying to sell it. He was like, it's like YMCA, but with the US at the front, a USMCA. I thought that was ridiculous that he has to sell this name, but not totally unfair to just call it an agreement as opposed to a free trade agreement. But let's get more into the specifics. So first off, a lot of people are dealing with this now as that NAFTA is solved and done with. A lot of media sources have been talking like it's all done and finished, and Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland have had a huge success. Obviously, it's not finished. It needs to be ratified by Congress and the House of Commons, and you see every day the Conservatives are hassling them as they should in the opposition. Maybe not quite as extreme as they should, but it's clearly not finished. So while this is a step in the right direction because we have some sort of formal agreement, they're not totally giving us the cold shoulder. We're not finished yet. The media were quick to call it a huge success, and I think that's a bit of a result of course, the sour kind of negotiations that we've been hearing from out of the Trump side of things, but also from Trudeau's own rhetoric, because for weeks he's been saying no deal is better than a bad deal, no deal is better than a bad deal, preparing everyone for no deal. So any deal was excited now. But if you actually look into the details of it, not so favorable. And I mean, we never should have expected, as I've been always saying, to get a great deal out of this. The U.S. just has more leverage, and although we do have important forms of leverage, especially heading into the midterms, with a lot of the swing states right along the border actually being fairly dependent on a majority of their trade on Canada. So heading into the midterms, it's likely why Trump went from saying there's like he was using these tariffs and throwing around, talking about imposing auto tariffs on top of the steel and aluminum tariffs, and how it's going to be a great deal and America's going to get everything they want. And then all of a sudden he just signs this kind of mediocre kind of deal that's pretty much filled with maybe slightly American-sided compromises on Canada's part. Nothing extreme, I would say. But it seems that Trump wants to hurry to some sort of agreement ahead of the midterms next month at this point, I guess. So I guess that works out for Canada pretty favorably. We should definitely continue to use the midterms in our favor in future negotiations. But I'm still an advocate for some more extreme kind of positions from the Canadian side of things. It seems like the main thing that Canada wants, at least from the articles that were released this week, is the dispute settlement mechanism. And I really think Canada kind of showed its cards pretty early, and the U.S. has been able to manipulate really what we have open stated as important to us from the start, even though I really don't think that the dispute settlement clause is something that Trump really had a problem with compared to our soft protectionism across the board. So I would really like to see the Canadian negotiators really take a more hardline stance and be willing to put not just a fraction of our like solid milk products on the table, but a more extreme stance in opening up in opening up our trade to get a really positive result for Canadian consumers and Canadian workers. The way it is now, they've increased the kind of amount of market share that milk producers can receive. That milk producers can reach into the Canadian markets from American markets. They have not repealed the steel and aluminum tariffs. They're not going to put auto tariffs quite yet. It's still up in the air, but they did create a quota for the amount of automobiles that can be sent from Canada into the U.S., which is I guess it limits our growth, but it is above the current our current export of cars and unfinished cars to the United States. So it allows for good growth, but I guess it would have to be renegotiated sometimes in the future if the manufacturing sector is really growing in the North American market, as it has been since Trump has been in power. So the quota may be a problem in the future, but it's not really a huge problem right now. If anything, it should expand the industry. But one of the most controversial things that a lot of pundits have been pointing out is there's a kind of innocuous clause that prevents Canada or any of the member states from going into trade negotiations with any non-market country, which I think is just basically three countries. It's like Taiwan, China, and I can't even think. It's one more main country, but the main country is China, who Canada has pursued trade ties with, a free trade agreement with in the last year and a half. Surprisingly, countries like Russia and other kind of statist regimes are not on this list, so it's a pretty clear kind of target at trade with China. And it's not surprising, considering the U.S. has been really hard on Chinese trade practices since Donald Trump has come into office. They've been putting tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs, and they've been very critical of China's kind of more unfair trade practices surrounding intellectual property rights, including manipulation of their kind of artificial deflation of their currency and stuff like this, that makes it very difficult for America and really any developed westernized country to compete with China, especially when it comes to manufacturing. So obviously they're trying to extend that to Mexico and Canada. So a lot of pundits have been quick to say that we signed away too much of our sovereignty through this agreement because now the U.S. gets a kind of veto over that. Personally, I don't have much of a problem with it. I don't think a free trade agreement with China is necessarily beneficial. While I'm generally open to free trade, I personally think that we should be focusing our free trade with countries that we agree with, kind of from a human rights perspective, and with countries that we're more similar with from a economic kind of ideological standpoint as well. Otherwise, there are kind of adverse effects across the board that happen. The globalization of trade and the opening of the Chinese market economy has really served as one of the key influences on what has depressed middle income workers' wages over the last few decades. The option of having that low-skilled, low-wage work for like literal pennies on the dollar, if not less, compared to the North American worker, has been impossible to compete with. And opening it up to free trade and making that even cheaper for manufacturers would cause a further depression in Canadian wages. In addition, as the American administration has been quick to point out, China has a bunch of unfair trade practices that we really shouldn't open ourselves up to, in my opinion. I think trade with China currently is favorable and does give us lower costs. And while free trade with China would open us up to some more low quality, low cost goods, I don't think the benefit is really there. I think there's a lot of adverse political effects that would come of that. And especially considering that our most important partner, the U.S., is so negative towards China right now, I think it would be kind of political suicide almost for us from a foreign policy perspective for us to try and pursue any sort of closer relations with China. So while people have been really skeptical of that clause, I don't think it's a huge deal, although it is definitely the U.S. trying to extend its sovereignty and use its leverage to control kind of some of its trade partners, which is definitely a controversial aspect. It's just in an area where I agree with, so I can't care too much. Like, I'll point out the overreach, but overall, I can't be too upset. Anything else big with the new USMCA? So that, for those who don't know yet, the USMCA stands for the U.S. Mexico Canada Trade Agreement. I like how we got tacked on at the end. I missed the cuff to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and we were right at the front. That's when a golden age in Canadian international trade. Okay, let's see if there's anything else really important to touch on, or if we can just jump to the last kind of... Oh, okay, this was almost forgot. Another big area where the Canadian government kind of lost out, where, and this is discussed in our NAFTA video as well, was pharmaceuticals. So the issue with pharmaceuticals in the negotiations was American corporations, generally referred to as big pharma, generally shoulder most of the research and development costs, while international firms, including Canadian firms, do less research and development and come up with less popular drugs, but just reproduce based off of other people's inventions and discoveries and such. So for a long time, it's been a difficulty given the market system, and I think this kind of was pointed out with the whole Shkreli scandal. But sometimes, given the market forces, it's difficult to produce a drug and make a profit based off of the research and development costs. And really, we should be rewarding companies that are able to effectively research and develop and churn out high quality drugs that help people. So in the agreements that the U.S. was extending to seek out those the duration that a company would maintain its intellectual property rights, and they were successful, at least in this draft of the USMCA, extending the duration from 8 to 10 years. The U.S. apparently was pushing for 12, but settled on 10, which sounds conspicuously like, I'm going to overbet you a bit and accept what I actually wanted, which was 10. Again, overall, this seems like a fair decision. I think it is important to reward those companies, even though it's often fear-mongered as these evil big pharmaceutical companies or big pharma taking advantage of people that are sick to profit off of, and it's terrible and it's unfair. But in the end of the day, as has been pointed out, a lot of these drugs are hard to produce with companies able to undercut them by not doing as much research and development. And at the end of the day, we should be rewarding and incentivizing companies to produce good and popular drugs, just like any market system. So maybe this will also incentivize, this will also guarantee a higher level of profit for anyone who does research and development. So it might even encourage more Canadian firms to invest more in research and development, which would be good. More competition across the board and more life-saving medicine. And if we can encourage more research and development across the board and get more competition in that sphere, we might get more efficient processes, as we would expect from the marketplace. Other than that, there's not a lot of big stuff. I guess there was some BC wine stuff before they were guaranteed positions in Canada's grocery stores, or at least in grocery stores in BC. Now that's not anymore, so they'll have more competition from American wines. Just removing some protectionism, opening up the wineries to more competition. They've been around for a long time. They should be able to deal with new demands from the economy and such. But that's pretty much the important parts of the USMCA. We were able to maintain Chapter 19, so that's huge. Another thing is Indigenous rights, while not explicitly given a chapter, there is some inclusive language with which Canada might count as a win, but again, it's kind of stretching it. But those are the important things. Obviously, I have not had the time, and we'll see if I have the capacity to read through the whole agreement. It is massive and filled with trade law language with which I'm only so familiar. But I'm sure we'll have reports by investigative journalists over the next few days pointing out anything strange or innocuous. But if only these kind of agreements were more attainable for the public to actually read and not need trade lawyers and stuff to kind of explain and understand properly, we could really keep the government to account. But this, we are kind of reliant on a media class. We'll see how the agreement changes over the next few days and over the next and leading up to the midterms especially. We'll see if the Canadians try and do anything big, because it could be big, right? Like, strategically speaking, if Trump's made it obvious that he wants to have some sort of more stable, so like establishing even this kind of early draft of the USMCA has had great benefits in Canada. Our economy really stabilized with less uncertainty, and the dollar started to go back up. Whenever people complain that the dollar is down, I kind of get confused, considering we're an export-based economy, and having a lower dollar increases exports, so it has kind of a self-balancing effect. But now that our dollar's rising and our economy's strong, it is good for Canadian consumers, absolutely. So yeah, it's important to realize that while the economy is becoming more stabilized, it does seem that Trump wants to have some sort of agreement heading into midterms to promote stability and to maintain those houses, because again, if he loses Congress, it would not be surprising to see him impeached. It would not be surprising to see him impeached. But if he maintains the houses, there's no chance. So it's really life or death for him. So we can, if he continues to make it clear that he wants some sort of agreement heading into the vote, we can really take advantage of that, right? We can play along, and then at the last minute, we can throw the pie in his face and try and really get some wins. But again, no matter, even if we're going to play like that, play a little bit more dirty and a little bit more underhanded, I think it is important to concede on areas that we know that they want, because it is, at the end of the day, important to keep good relations with this country. But I guess if Canada deems that not having Donald Trump in power is more favorable, for Canada, then they could try and, you know, screw them over at the last minute and really screw them up in the polls. But I'm not sure if that would be to Canada's benefit. Of course, FBI trials and stuff withstanding, he could be horrendously guilty of crimes that are not yet totally substantiated, at least in the public sphere. But the growth, the massive growth economically in the United States, and his actions to pull manufacturing back to the side of the world are both huge wins for Canada. If we can align ourselves better, economically speaking, with metrics like the corporate tax rate and stuff like this, to kind of jump on this kind of bandwagon with the United States, it could be huge for the Canadian economy. We have a lot of similar problems at the end of the day, right? The kind of hollowing of our manufacturing sector by globalization and the stagnating wages and stuff. It's basically happening the same on either side of the borders. So to say that Donald Trump, even though he can be nasty and say stupid stuff, is bad for Canada as a whole, I don't think that's a clear assumption. Anyways, let's jump away from NAFTA. I think we've got a pretty good update for this week, and jump into this kind of final segment that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few weeks. I met with one of my buddies a couple weeks ago to have a couple of beers and talk politics, as I do with most of my friends, because all I care about is politics nowadays, and the Toronto FC. We're going to make playoffs. And he asked me what I thought of the political compass, and I actually really enjoyed that he asked me this, because I do have a lot of thoughts on the political compass, and it's not a question I get very often. So for those not familiar, let's get this up here. Oh no. Okay, give me 1 second. We're gonna get some rudimentary visuals going here, because I think it'll help understand things. So let's, okay. Sorry for the delay here, guys. Here we go. Okay, so this is what is known as the political compass. So the political compass is a kind of, it's supposed to be a way of determining kind of a government or a individual's political opinion in a way that we can talk about, just like identifiers like left and right are usually. But this one is a little bit different. It splits it up into, instead of having one axis, having two axes. One that's economic left, economic right, and authoritarian to libertarian. Sometimes the first axis is just labeled right and left. I don't think that, so while generally speaking I'm not a huge fan of labels, and I'm not sure if I've talked about that before on this channel, but especially the most common ones, right and left, are so such broad definitions that have kind of connotations in every single aspect of political life, whether it's your opinion on the welfare state, or your opinion on foreign policy, or your opinions on interventionism, or like literally every single aspect has a kind of left or right common opinion. So I think those are two really broad kind of, I guess in this case, if you specify to economic, it's a little bit more specific, but then I've always found the kind of authoritarian to libertarian kind of axis a little bit arbitrary, because there are so many other, like, you could really include authoritarian and libertarian into the left-right axis themselves. I think libertarian is mostly thought of as a more right-wing concept, and authoritarian is is more of a left-wing concept, and I don't know if that's self-evident, but I would explain that as a libertarian is a very individualistic ideology, whereas authoritarian is more of a collectivist ideology. And if you were to put collectivist versus individualist to the left-right spectrum, it would definitely align with individualism is more right-wing, and that's clear from the more economic perspective, where they are more into property rights and individual freedoms and more of a market economy, whereas the left is more collectivist in that they promote more government ownership and stuff like this. So I think it's arbitrary to choose authoritarian and libertarian to pull out of the right-left dichotomy. At that point, I think you might be better off creating almost a circle of many different attributes, and then you'd have to do a kind of I have no idea what you call that kind of graph, but it would be kind of a circle that would come out further, and depending on the metric, and maybe that would be a effective way to really break down someone's opinions. But I don't think this is substantial enough, really. I think right or left is just as helpful as this. I really think that this was created by probably some libertarians trying to influence people and show them that everyone's a libertarian, because if you were to graph, if you were just to take like 5 of the most famous governments of all time, or 10 of them or whatever, and you were to graph them on this, you'd have all the terrible, evil ones in the authoritarian side. You'd have, Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and all the people that most people find to be terrible killers on the authoritarian part, whereas all like the more standard governments, like, pretty much every president throughout history and pretty much every prime minister and any leader of a developed country is going to just fall into the libertarian category, just because they're not, because they act within a democratic system, and they can't their authoritarian abilities are incredibly limited by that, because that is the reason democratic systems are put together, to kind of prevent against authoritarianism in their country. So it's kind of, I think it's kind of a trick to make everyone realize they're libertarian, because to me, economic left and libertarian left, like this whole kind of sector in the bottom left corner, doesn't really make much sense to me. That's kind of like the kind of Antifa, anarcho-communism. It's an oxymoron. It contradicts itself. Like, you can't have a communist state, which would be state dependent on providing services and jobs and managing resources, and simultaneously have anarchy, which is there's no state. So who would manage? It doesn't clearly make sense. But I guess it would be an individualist society where they just all shared stuff because everyone's a good person. So I guess it's kind of a utopian idea that just seems unrealistic to me, and I just don't think this shows the whole story. So I want to kind of transition from this into a little segment on the political spectrum in Canada, because I think it kind of transitions kind of effectively. And I think the political spectrum in Canada is, I think the political spectrum in most countries, although I'm not as into a lot of other countries' politics, but I believe the political spectrum and where the parties lie along it is typically a very malleable thing, and it definitely is in Canadian politics. So I guess this is going to be a bit of a boring lesson maybe, but if you're interested in if party systems and electoral politics, this segment's for you. And this is really what I'm interested in in politics and Canadian politics and politics in general. I think this is, I just think it's absolutely fascinating. So let's get some visuals to help us out a little bit. Okay. So there we go. So here I just got a little line, which is going to represent our political spectrum. Left to right is pretty obvious. And just some logos of the parties that I'm going to place along the line to provide you with a little bit of a visual. But basically, if we identify left and right, as I was before, as kind of collectivist versus individualist, typically we could align the... Okay, so Canada's a generally left-wing country. So none of our parties are really extremely right-wing, and I think this is a pretty common kind of critique about Canadian politics. So even our right-wing parties, traditionally the Conservatives, at their time the Reform or the Canadian Alliance, these parties, while they are right, they're generally close to the center. And when talking about parties, I think it is important to differentiate between two different kinds of parties. And at least this is what I found in my studies and my while doing my political science degree. I wrote about party systems and electoral politics a couple of times, and it's an issue that I've always been personally a big fan of. So that's good stuff. Okay. So I'd like to differentiate between two different kinds of parties. So we have brokerage parties and we have ideological parties. Brokerage parties are kind of, let's call them big tent or catch-all parties. They're not as ideologically zealous as, or they're not as committed to any particular ideology, kind of like ideological parties. But they are, they tend to promote more moderate policies that don't offend people and attract lots of voters. And maybe they'll steal some policies from the ideological parties if it's popular and receiving votes. But typically speaking, they'll just adopt kind of a little bit more moderate versions of what the more extreme parties will adopt. So in Canada, your brokerage parties are, there's one on either side of the major political spectrum. So let's just add another line. So let's say this is the center. So the Liberals are typically thought of as a center-left party. They're the brokerage party, and they're the most successful party in Canadian politics in all time, winning just a slight majority of the elections across Canadian history. Although the Canadian and the Conservatives in their various forms are the only two to actually sit as leaders of the country. They're the main, they take more moderate views on left-wing issues, and in more modern history, we've seen them being, as a lot of people like to say, fiscally conservative, but socially liberal. And I'm going to, just to preface this, I'm going to start out with a kind of more historic, like how things have been throughout my lifetime, which isn't particularly long, but traditionally speaking, that's kind of the position of the Liberals. Now the Conservatives are the catch-all party on the right, and they tend to, for most of Canadian politics, there hasn't been a further right party. So they tend to struggle with this weird big party status where they have to accept absolutely everyone, socially conservative people, libertarians, just red Tories, all sorts of different kind of breeds of conservatism, or social conservatives, into this one party instead of having kind of other smaller parties to kind of pull away some support and make their platform a little more concise. They're in this weird position. How do I select images? I am no paint expert. I'm going to be totally honest here, guys. So your more ideological parties in Canada, for most of my lifetime, were the Green Party, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois. the Bloc Québécois has obviously fallen off hugely in the last few years, and hardly have a place in modern Canadian politics. But the Green Party and the NDP have been classically the more left-wing ideological parties, obviously surrounded by focusing more on social justice and environmental rights and regulations and stuff like this. And they serve this specific purpose of maybe not receiving the most votes, but producing new policies, more extreme policies, which the brokerage parties can look at and adopt if it's popular or if it seems successful. This is really the role of ideological parties, and to really give a voice to that fringe within society. So it's been a popular problem that voter turnout rates in a lot of developed countries have been declining, sitting around 65 to 70%. And perhaps at least a portion of these, that 35%, 30%, is not just lazy, uninterested, disengaged, but maybe they just literally don't have a representation. So it is important to have some ideological parties to kind of fill in the cracks and develop this more extreme policies that Canadians can look at and the brokerage parties can look at to really be successful. But typically we expect only the brokerage parties to be successful in Canadian politics, at least given the first past the post. First past the post really favors moderate parties, because they're able to catch more votes than, especially in specific areas, right? This is why proportional representation is usually advocated by more ideological parties that would actually get a lot more power and a lot more seats from having a proportional system. Whereas even though the Liberals did promise to look at electoral reform, you shouldn't believe a brokerage party, because especially the Liberals in that context, because they would be benefiting most of all. But even the Conservatives, if they campaigned on that kind of area, I wouldn't believe them, because it just simply doesn't benefit them in the way that it would benefit fringe parties like the Greens and the NDP. Okay, so let's kind of switch over from. So traditionally speaking, you'd have your Conservative Party slightly right of the center, you'd have your Liberals slightly left of the center, and then you'd have your NDP and Green kind of fighting it off at the fringe. Now, in the more modern, the contemporary political landscape, like we see it today, things are quite different, I would say. In the last election, and this is a kind of typical battle that the NDP and the Liberals have been having over the last few elections, I find. I feel like the NDP is kind of having identity issues, and they're not sure if they want to remain this kind of ideological party or try and transition to be a brokerage party. They're frustrated with their lack of electoral success, and they kind of want to change strategies, but then there's the NDP faithful, which I do think makes up a lot of their voters, which just don't reward them when they try and go more central. So I think you saw this in the Ontario election. I think you saw this in the last federal election. The leaders of the Liberals and the NDP kind of duking it out. I think you saw Kathleen Wynne. So in Ontario, Kathleen Wynne delivered that huge labor bill that Doug is kind of digging up right now. That kind of promised higher minimum wages, more labor rights, and then they also did the whole dental care thing and pharmaceuticals for young people and stuff like that. So they went a more left-wing approach, and then the NDP, I think, learning from the failings of the federal NDP, really doubled down and went even further left than that, saying it would be dental care for everyone and pharmacy for everyone and sanctuary province and more immigration and on every feet just out-lefting them. Because I really think that's what lost Thomas Mulcair the election. If you recall back to the 2015 election, similarly in Ontario, the the Liberals or the NDP were riding high early in the campaign as the choice for because the Liberals have been struggling over the last few years to like find a new leader before they settled on Justin Trudeau. So they weren't really seen as a serious oppositional party, and the NDP had been successful, especially in like 2011 election before it. They were the official opposition, right? So they were polling high at the beginning of the campaign, but then gradually started to drop off. Thomas Mulcair was widely criticized for having too moderate policies. He tried to fall into the Liberals' spot, and the Liberals just kind of accepted that and went further left, and it was a successful strategy for them. I think that's very telling in the way that Andrea Horwath played the election. But obviously, neither were successful because the NDP is struggling with those identity issues. And even though they failed to be a pro-courage party, and then they tried to be an ideological party. But when you're an ideological party, you're limited. You're limited to a fraction of the vote. Like there's tons of rational people that you talk to, reasonable people that just will not consider the NDP because they don't think their extreme platform is warranted. And I think that's a pretty reasonable position, personally speaking. So I think in federal politics recently, you've seen that, and afterwards you saw Thomas Mulcair fire or leave the party, or step down from the leadership, and Jagmeet Singh has replaced him. So I think and Jagmeet Singh has done an absolutely awful job since he has taken the leadership of the party. Like, absolutely awful. Like, I don't know where the party stands, and he doesn't either. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that clip already when Jagmeet struggles to remember a policy point. I think it's on gun rights. Maybe I can pull it up for you, Jagmeet Singh.
Gun bills, I haven't understand your answer. Like, is your caucus behind you on this bill to support the bill?
Right, on this bill, our critic is Matthew Dubé. Yeah, and so he's provided a way forward in terms of our position on the bill. The principles will always remain. We want to create a safe country and make sure that we have laws that increase safety, and we've said that this, as it stands right now, this is something that does address issues of safety.
Caucus agrees with you supporting that bill.
Right now, this is something that our porte-parole, Mathieu Dubé, has responded to and has made it.
Can you tell us whether or not your caucus is behind you in supporting this bill?
At this point, just give me a moment. I have to clarify. Yeah. So yes, right now our caucus is in support of this bill.
So there it is. He doesn't know. The leader can't confidently say what his opinions on policy are and whether or not his caucus supports him. A little bit absurd, I would say. The guy in the background is Guy Caron, his former leadership rival, helping him out on how to be leader in what he believes in. So I think, similarly to Jagmeet, the majority of Canadians don't know where the NDP stand anymore. And if you look at recent elections in New Brunswick, in the last Quebec by-election, Quebec, a province where the NDP has seen a lot of success in recent years, where they came dead last in the by-election, the NDP just doesn't look like they will stand up as a major party in the next election. I really don't think so. And I think Jagmeet Singh is running to actually get into the House of Commons, which he hasn't been in since he's been elected leader. And I haven't seen anything on that since he announced his candidacy and announced that he was running and announced that he was moving to Burnaby. And if he doesn't get elected there, that would be the nail in the coffin, and maybe that would be good for the NDP. They could get a new leader, but honestly, if their last leadership race was if that demonstrates the kind of candidates that will run in a subsequent one to replace him, it doesn't look good for the NDP regardless. There doesn't seem to be an obvious leader, including their current leader, that could bring them success in the next election. So typically where you'd put the NDP far left, I guess we'll assume that they're still over there, but that's not clear. And the Green Party will continue to be on the far left. That's for sure. But I think the most interesting story is the Liberals. And the Liberals, I think, have, as I mentioned, they jumped to the left in the last election to win some votes away from the NDP. But this is, but they've kind of remained over there on the left, and quite ideologically so. Like, Justin Trudeau is zealously focused on a number of kind of more Marxist kind of ideologies like feminism and environmentalism and stuff like this, social constructivism. These kind of, and their entire, like, their last budget was totally about women and feminism. Like, they're very, very far left government. They nationalized the pipeline to solve that problem. Like, they've jumped far, and they've been running huge deficits, mounting deficits, which are negative. They're going to hurt our children, and we're going to be paying these back for a long time and struggling to pay back the huge interest rate payments that we're putting on when our economy isn't really in a place where we need to be deficit spending. It's just inappropriate. So they've really moved far left. In a world where the NDP, their leader and ideology is non-obvious, in the Green Party, who actually tend to run a pretty moderate platform aside from some of their more environmental positions, the Liberal seems to be the most obvious left-wing party. And that's just the start. A lot of that was historical, I know, but now we're going to be jumping right to the present with the kind of dichotomy on the other side of the spectrum between the Conservatives and Maxime Bernier's new People's Party of Canada. So, in a similar strategy of this kind of move to the left to steal voters that the Liberals did to the NDP, it really seems to me that that's exactly what the Conservative Party of Canada is doing right now in an effort to try and win the next election. Instead of stating their kind of principled policy, which I guess we don't typically expect from a brokerage party, as I was explaining earlier, the Conservatives have jumped further to the left. And that's because instead of targeting their kind of base voter and trying to fire up the base and get them out to the polls, Andrew Scheer and the CPC seem to have decided that Justin Trudeau is failing fabulously. I would agree with that. And I think that's obvious from just about every aspect of Justin Trudeau's policy, from foreign policy to domestic policy to the NAFTA negotiations to ethics scandals. Across the board, Justin Trudeau has been an absolute failure. So instead of firing out the base and seeming like a scary conservative, Andrew Scheer has decided to jump to the left and try and just attract all the liberal disenfranchised voters, all the voters that are just fed up with Justin Trudeau's virtue signaling and PR prime ministerial style, and just want someone who will, lead Canada and not be such a doofus doing it. So Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives they haven't delivered any sort of coherent platform points. Most of the things that they've said about major topics such as the economy, immigration, are just simply not conservative positions. We see them saying they're going to lower taxes, as the Conservative governments always do, but they don't provide any specific area in which they're going to cut to lower those taxes. How are they going to lower the taxes? Like, are they going to increase our budget deficits at a time that we need to be paying back the deficits? What's their plan? What are they going to cut? They don't want to say what they're going to cut because it would be controversial. It would lose them votes. So they just say nothing. They just say, we're the Conservatives, we're going to cut taxes. They don't say how much they're going to cut them. They don't say when they're going to cut them. They don't say how they're going to cut them. It's BS. Supply management, an absolutely non-conservative position to manage this, to have a government manage the supply and fix the price of any industry, especially one massive as some agricultural industries, is simply not a conservative idea. And it's unanimous within the Conservative Party, at least now that Max is gone. Immigration. The Michelle Rempel has made it clear that the Conservative plan is not to, at least to deal with the massive waves, or at least the massive influx of illegal border crossers or regular migrants or whatever the heck you want to call them. Michelle Rempel has made it clear that the plan is to grandfather all these people into the system, and there's been over 30,000, edging on getting, and the numbers are not totally clear, but I think the last I saw was 42,000, going up to 50,000. We're gonna have 100,000 refugees combined between the Syrians that were the vetted immigrants that we brought in, and the illegal border crossers, which are unvetted and are not even clearly refugees in most cases. So it's absolutely absurd that the Conservatives are willing to, grandfather these people into the system, whereas it's just simply not a conservative position. Immigration in general is going to obviously change the fabric of the country in whatever way, positive or negative. It's simply not conservative to change to change the population, to change the culture, to just simply change the population. It's not conserving anything. It's progressing in a different direction for sure. So in pretty much every major area, not only is the Conservative not forthcoming with what their platform is, when they are, it's simply not conservative. So I would say that the Conservative are either sitting like flat on the center, maybe a little bit to the left of that, maybe a little bit to the right. Let's just leave them right on the center, and they're your typical kind of brokerage party. No, all promises, no explanation. They're doing politics the way I do not respect, and that is to say, this person is obviously failing, so we'll just win silently. Win silently. That's how I'm going to put it. And I do think that's how Doug Ford got into power. He seems to have more freedom now that he's in power, but leading up to the election, he was very clearly muzzled. And maybe that was good for the Conservatives for sure, but I don't like politicians trying to win by not hurting people's feelings, by not being controversial, by not saying what they believe. I don't support that. I want principled people to tell me what they think is best for the best for the country, and I want to vote for the one that I think is most right, and I think ideas will most help the country. Not just vote against the person who's least good at the job. I'm so fed up with that kind of idea in Canadian politics that every election we don't vote for who we most like, but against who we most hate. I'm absolutely fed up with that. And I think that's one thing that really excites me about the People's Party of Canada personally. So let's jump over to there. So the People's Party of Canada is the only right-wing party in the country. The milkmen or the sheer fanboys, they might disagree with me and say you're just splitting the vote, but this is thoroughly what I understand. Just as I outlined on all of those major policy areas, the Conservative Party of Canada is simply not conservative. If you look at the People's Party of Canada, the reason this party exists is because Maxime thought the party was intellectually and morally corrupt, quote, and that's because they don't, while they call themselves conservatives, they don't act conservative. They're clearly intellectually corrupt, as they call themselves right-wing, and they don't govern or they don't offer any right-wing solutions. So in the area of immigration, Maxime wants to deport those who aren't aren't officially refugees. Reasonable obvious platform position. The people that do not qualify and that broke our laws to get into this country do not belong in our country, especially those ones that are not even economically disadvantaged, that do not qualify for refugee status in any sense of the word. Absolutely, these people should be deported. It's more confusing when their claim is sought to be legitimate, but the vast majority of these claims are not legitimate based off of where they're sourced from. It's just, and even by the government's own admission, they're just simply not legitimate, and they should be deported, not even to their country of origin, but to the United States, because that's where they came from. We don't need to spend all the money getting them back across oceans and such. From an economic perspective, Max is in favor of cutting corporate tax. That makes us more competitive with the United States, who just recently slashed their corporate tax rate. In personal income tax, he wants to simplify it and make it so that there are 3 clear brackets. People making under $15,000, which is basically people only working part-time, would get taxed at a rate of 0. That would be huge for people in Ontario, since Doug Ford has advocated for something similar, even saying up to 30,000, I think. So if Max were to be in power, if you're making under $15,000, you would be getting taxed at an income rate of 0. That would be huge. That would be big for people to, penetrate into the higher social classes, not being taxed at all. Pretty reasonable position. Maybe not as far left as you'd say the negative income tax rate, but definitely a progressive idea to stop this kind of cyclical poverty, which is really a problem. And then I think above that, it's a rate of 15%, and then above 100,000 or 200,000. Maybe I should check. There would be a rate of 25%. So much more simple. Currently, we have like a 5-tier kind of system, and I think that's confusing and ineffective. And according to the most recent tax revenues, not even practical at bringing in increased tax revenues. So we increased our marginal tax rate on Canada's highest earners, and we made less money, and that doesn't technically make sense, because you'd think if we were taking more money from rich people, we'd be getting more money. But the reality is this, A, discourages people from making that marginal dollar, and also B, the super rich can move their money around in ways that less wealthy people just can't. Like, they can create offshore accounts and store their money in property and assets in ways which I guess are technically, in some cases, can be productive. So if we increase our marginal tax rate and it encourages people to invest back into the country, that's great. But oftentimes it just ends up with this money going into offshore accounts and no one getting to tax it, which just isn't good for the lower classes. It's it relates to this concept in economics called the Laffer curve. When you it's literally, as you increase the marginal tax rate, you eventually decrease tax revenue. So there's definitely some firm basis there for why Max's plan might not only save Canadians some money, especially the lower class, but also even increase tax revenues possibly. And then even on topics like the equalization formula and interprovincial trade and healthcare, Max is the only right-wing alternative on all of these issues. He wants to increase privatization of the healthcare sector, which tends to be a controversial, taboo topic in Canadian politics because for some reason, literally Canadian identity, at least for people my age, we're not Americans and we have healthcare, which isn't an identity. It's a policy point and a fact. It's silly, but Canadian healthcare, the costs have been going up. It's at least compared to a lot of other developed countries, in most other developed countries have a more open two-tier system. So opening it up to the free market a little bit will reduce wait times, increase innovation. There are maybe more nuanced ways to do it to kind of maybe force doctors to work some pro bono hours in the public healthcare system instead of driving all the doctors into the private system. But making for a two-tier healthcare system, I think, is going to help everyone. All over the board, he's the only politician that is looking to providing real ways and looking to eliminate taxes. He's the only politician that's looking to disable some of Canada's cartels. He's the only one that's looking to have freer trade. He's the only politician that wants to take Canada in a seriously different direction. Just to clear it up, it's a 15% tax rate on those above 15,000 and a 25% tax rate on those above 100,000. So that's how that works. But he's the only politician that's going to take Canada in another direction. Justin Trudeau he's led us astray with his incompetence and his blind, regressive progressivism. And Andrew Scheer is not going to turn us around. He's going to slow down the kind of negative effects that Justin Trudeau has had on our country. And if you're interested in really a change, in really some changes that will help labor in Canada, that will make prices cheaper, that will make our economy more efficient and more aligned with the U.S. and to preserve our culture and improve assimilation, some of these more conservative ideas even. But he's the only leader that will do this, and Justin Trudeau has saddled us with enormous debt, made us an embarrassment on the international stage, been a joke at managing Canada's limited soft power into some sort of positive international impact in foreign relations. And Scheer is just not a real alternative. He is not hard enough in opposition on Justin Trudeau. He's not a bold and strong leader. And the only bold and strong leader that we have as an option in Canada is absolutely Maxime Bernier. We left with Jagmeet Singh, who has no idea what he's doing. He doesn't know how to get his message out. He doesn't know what his message is. We have Justin Trudeau, who's absolutely incompetent. He's a puppet for progressivists and globalists, a la Jerry Butts. And Scheer is just no better. He's just hoping that Justin Trudeau can fail enough so that he can win, instead of really offering Canadians a real plan in the other direction. So in this modern kind of Canadian landscape, I think we have one right-wing party. We have the People's Party. We have one centrist party. This is the CPC. We have one far left party, or we have two far left parties, the NDPs and the Greens, and then we have the Liberals and the Greens, and then we just have the NDP. They're like the kid in the corner eating glue or something. They don't know if they want to be a brokerage party, an ideological party. They don't know. They like all these kind of crazy socialist policies that don't generally work, and their leader is absolutely and totally lost. So I think that pretty much rounds up Daniel's rant. I think that I apologize for at the end there. I had a bit of problem. My paint skills are super substandard, as I think I mentioned earlier, and I couldn't continue ranting while trying to figure out how paint works effectively. Maybe in the future, or maybe we'll edit this sort of rant into another segment where we add some graphics to make it a little bit easier to understand. For those interested, please let me know if you enjoyed that segment or kind of the ranty style of this entire live stream. Don't forget to share the stream. We honestly get a bulk of our views after the stream is done. So get this far and wide if you really enjoyed it. if you're interested in any other topics, please send me a message directly to True North News or to my Facebook account, or online, or we can even cover it ourselves. Of course, we're always looking for stuff that people are particularly interested in. So with that, I guess we're pretty much signing off. Make sure to like, share, comment on the video. Jump over to our YouTube page and subscribe. We're looking for 100 subscribers there, so I can finally change my URL. Apparently, you can't rebrand yourself on YouTube unless you have 100 subscribers, which is weird policy in my opinion. But currently, my URL is stuck as an old video game username instead of being, properly branded as True North News, so we can be more brand aligned across platforms. That would be fantastic. Until next week, tune in again next week to True North News Live. We're trying to make these a big thing, and thanks for watching. I really enjoyed myself. So have a fantastic night, everyone. Goodbye.